Greetings everyone, Erik Albertson here from World War II Armor. Today we're going to talk a little bit of history about a unique uniform item worn by United States Army tankers that are one of the longest continuing uniform items that are based for a certain occupation within the military. And that item today we're talking about is the tank boot, or in modern parlance, the tanker boot. Now the tanker boot has been around since 1937. And it has been worn since then up until this day with modern day tankers in the United States Army. Over the time, being a retired Army and a former tanker myself, I've heard all kinds of stories and legends as to why these boots were designed the way they were, and the purpose of them, and the origin, and how they came about. Now, as like many stories, sometimes there's a little bit of a grain of truth in the story. A lot of times that's not quite accurate. And so what our goal today is to teach you the real history, its origin, its inspiration, how it came about, what it was designed for, and what the real reason why it was designed and what the true purpose was. Before we get into its true history, what I would like to do is talk about some of the legends, the myths, the stories that have evolved over the years that have been passed down from generations of Army tankers to the next generation, so on and so on. As a young tanker myself, many years ago, I heard these stories, and as I moved up through the ranks, I continue to tell the stories as well. When the tank boot comes on conversation on social media, I often see other tankers, friends, colleagues, peers, continue to share these stories, and they're not quite accurate. And so that's why we want to do this video today, is to talk about and teach you the real history of their origin, so that not only can we learn together about this unique uniform item worn by Army tankers for current generations, past generations, but also future generations of tankers. It's an important piece of our armor history, and that's what we do here at World War II Armor. We preserve and teach. So the first legend or story I want to focus on the origins, these myths of the origins of the tanker boot. And one that I hear often, and I heard recently on a documentary, which I'll admit I've heard a few times, but not that many times. Then when I saw the documentary, it came back, I was like, oh, I got to remember to talk about that. So this legend goes that during the Battle of the Bulge in the European Theater of Operations in December 1944 to January 1945, it was so cold during the Battle of the Bulge that the infantrymen's bootlaces were freezing and they were breaking. So tankers, being the good-hearted nature soldiers that they are, gave up their bootlaces to the infantrymen. And in turn, they used their belts. A lot of times when I hear the story, people say it's leather belts, but the problem is the belt that was worn by GIs was actually a cotton webbing belt, not leather belt at all. In fact, the only leather belts they would have would be holding their pioneer tools on the tanks, but that was more so early war, and they were replaced with canvas belts later on. So the story is unique, and so the story goes that since they gave up their bootlaces, they would use their belts to wrap around their boots, thus the origin of the tank boot. Now, the problem with that story, that myth, is that the Battle of the Bulge took place in December 1944 to January 1945. If you recall in the beginning of this video, I said that the tanker boot had been around since 1937, so 7 years prior. So as great as the story is, its origin, it's not true, it's inaccurate, it's false. The next origin story goes to some of these boots you see over here, that they were the tanker boot got its history from the 1940 three-buckle cavalry boot, famously worn in the movie Fury by Brad Pitt. Now these are cool boots, I'll talk about them maybe a little bit more in the video, but these boots were created for mounted troopers, not just cavalry troopers, but also motorcycle riders and other dispatch riders in 1940, so 3 years after the tank boot was designed and produced. Now another boot that I commonly see people comment that the tanker boot was based on is the double buckle combat service boot. Now this boot was a late war boot that was designed in 1943 and was first issued to servicemen overseas in the fall of 1944. So 6-7 years again later after the tanker boot was first designed in 1937. So not true, not accurate. So those are two of the most common origin myths and legends that I've heard. And so the rest of the stories I'm going to go into are more safety. Now, when you hear these safety reasons, these safety stories, when you hear them, you hear folks talk about them, they kind of make sense. And they, you know, when you initially hear them, like, oh, that makes sense. You know, tanks, they're dangerous. It's better to have a safety boot. But when you actually get down into and you're digging into the history and kind of doing a little bit of deductive reasoning analysis, you kind of realize it's not true, it's not accurate. So the first safety legend that I'm going to talk about is the tanker boot was designed to for flame retardant purposes. They took away the boot laces because the laces, either made out of nylon or cotton or other materials, could be flammable. Thus, if exposed to fire inside the tank or a flashback, that is when after you fire the cannon, the breech ejects the shell and you get the flames inside the turret that could catch fire. Now, again, that safety story seems plausible because, you know, fire is not good and you don't want to catch on fire. The problem with that story, though, is tankers throughout history from World War I onward, even to present day, haven't always had flame retardant clothing. It really wasn't until the early to mid 1980s when the U.S. Army and the Marine Corps, I believe as well, was issued the Nomex combat vehicle coverall jumpsuit, gloves, balaclava, which nobody wears except for gunnery or when it's cold out, and that was the first flame retardant uniform. In World War II, the primary uniform was your standard herringbone twill cotton coveralls, not flame retardant as well. As years progressed, tankers continue to wear the normal duty uniform that every other GI wears, to include also other styles of coveralls. So the flame retardant purposes, it seems plausible, sounds, you know, seems like it could be real. But at the time the tanker boot was designed in 1937, again, I'm gonna keep on hitting that home, 1937, that was not the reason why. All right, so the second legend story that we're gonna talk about that's still within the safety realm and also within the flame retardant realm is that the tanker boot was designed, removing the laces with the leather straps, as tanks, when they fire their main gun, the casing would be ejected into the turret and the casing would land on the floor, thus potentially landing on the crewman's boot. Now, when you really think about this, the only crewman that really is going to be around the casings when they eject, if the tank is not equipped with a bag or catcher to catch the shells, which early tanks, especially American tanks, did not have during World War II, is the loader. The gunner is off to the right-hand side of the breech, the main gun. With him, the tank commander is behind him. Down in the hull of the vehicle, you have your driver, your bow gunner. So it's only really the loader. And the loader, once he has the availability and time, he's going to get those shells out of the tank, either through his hatch or through the pistol port, which some Sherman tanks, some American tanks in World War II did have. He's not going to leave these shells down on the floor. And also, he's not going to have a bunch of shells sitting on his boot. So the chance of the boot laces actually melting is very slim to none. And actually, to kind of get a little bit more into the nuanced history, again, the tanker boot in 1937, that tanks at the time in the U.S. Army's arsenal at the time was the M1 combat car that was used by the cavalry forces because they were not allowed to have tanks at that time due to the 1920 Defense Authorization Act. Only the infantry could have tanks. So that was the cavalry's way around of having tanks when the Army became more mechanized beginning in the 1930s. And so the M1 combat car, and then for the infantry side of the house, they had the M2 light tank. Now, both of these tanks, which really are very similar, they're both technically light tanks, but again, the cavalry had to call theirs the combat car. The main gun on that vehicle, both those vehicles, was the 50 caliber machine gun. Now, this is missing the projectile, which would go out about another inch and a half. This was your main armament on those vehicles. Secondary, two 30 caliber machine guns. All right, and so this would be your weapon. So when this boot was designed, these were the casings that were being fired and coming into the turret. Now the catch is with both of those vehicles, to kind of debunk that myth of the casing falling on the floor story, is both of those guns that were inside the turret of both those vehicles, they had a bag, a brass catching bag. So when they fired the machine gun, the brass would be collected in the bag. Once the bag got filled up, you dump it outside the tank. So you don't have a collection of brass gathering up on your feet, thus burning your boot laces. So again, very plausible story, but at the time when the boot was designed, it was not its intent or the reason why. It wasn't until 1939 with the introduction of the M2A4 light tank when the first main gun, bigger than a 50 caliber machine gun, was introduced. And that was a 37 millimeter cannon. So this would be the round, the projectile, and the casing that would be ejected when fired. Now later on in the war, the main workhorse of the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps during World War II was your 75 millimeter main gun. Now tanks later on in the war would be equipped with a 76 millimeter, 105 millimeter howitzer, and then late war the 90 millimeter, as you see behind me on the M36 Jackson gun motor carriage used by the tank destroyer forces. So it really was until the later part of the war, 1941, 1942, with the introduction of the M3 medium tank, where you saw a larger size caliber shell used. And again, once they were fired and they were on the floor of the turret, when the loader had the chance, he would pick them up, throw them out of the hatch, throw them out of the pistol port, and get them out of there. Didn't want a bunch of shells banging around. So another safety legend that often is in conversation every time that the story of the tank boot comes up. And again, like the other safety legends, it sounds plausible, it sounds legitimate, and no one's going to argue with it because it's safety. Safety is vital, it is important. And this legend is that the tanker boot or the tank boot removed the boot laces from your service shoe, and they added the leather straps. So because boot laces could become untangled and could get caught in the tank, different parts of the tank. The turret monster can eat your foot. It can cause serious injury and harm. Now again, that story seems legitimate. It is a safety reason. Now, soldiers in present time, our combat boots have longer laces. And you don't wear leggings on top of your boot because your combat boot is taller in height than 4 3/4 inches. At the time when the Armored Forces was established, the tank boot was established in 1937, the Armored Forces in 1940, and the Army really became a mechanized force. The boot laces were not that long. As you can see here, there's still 2 more eyelets, and the boot laces, I got about 8 more inches to work with. So the concern really not there. There's always that risk, but that same goes with your pockets or anything. If you're wearing a pistol belt during that time period, could get caught. Again, it sounds like a good reason, but it's not the accurate, true history of the boot. Now, the real history, the real why, the real intent, the inspiration to its design. Now, at the time, the 1930s, the standard U.S. service member wore a boot similar to this. Now, this is a later Type 3 service shoe, rough out, but previous versions, Type 1, Type 2, and then before that, really since the 1885 campaign boot, I believe it is, and then more into the World War I with the 1918 Pershing boot, was pretty much same standard boot, different models, different designs, but about 4.5, 6 inches, 7 inches high, 7 to 8 eyelets. There were a couple other garrison marching boots in the early 1900s, a little bit higher, but this was your standard boot. Now, one thing, having a lower boot like that, your ankles, your feet can be exposed to mud getting piled up in your boots, bugs, thorns, thistles, so on and so on. So what soldiers wore, really beginning in the U.S. Army Civil War with some units, more so in the 1870s, later 1890s during the Spanish-American War, it was our leggings. Now this is a 1938 canvas legging, which was the most common, and I mean canvas, not necessarily 1938, until 1938 onwards, but canvas leggings. And canvas leggings were the standard issue protection you would wear with your service shoe, service boot. Now there were different types, there were different variations. throughout the 1870s to the 1890s to World War I. Another style of legging that came out during the World War I era was the wool spiral wrap puttee, which was a woolen cloth that you would wrap around your ankle all the way up to about the midsection of your calf. And if you see photos from World War I, it's the most common legging that soldiers wore overseas, part of the American Expeditionary Forces. But when they first deployed overseas, at the time, they were also wearing canvas leggings. Now, back up a little bit. Cavalry troopers throughout time have always predominantly worn a higher boot, typically about mid-shin, upper calf length throughout history up until really the early 1900s, where they started to wear canvas leggings as well. So the cavalry, what they did, because leggings are a pain in the butt to put on. If you ask anybody who has ever worn them, either through military service or if you're in the living history, a reenactor, these are a pain to get on and put off and take off. And so you have to spend a good quality amount of time getting these things on before you start your day. So what the cavalry did to kind of alleviate some of that pain for the cavalry troopers, and not just cavalry troopers, but also mounted personnel, is they designed what's called the 1911 puttee. It's a leather piece of leather. It's about 12 inches in height, and it's got a leather strap, buckle at the bottom and the top to wrap around. So you would wear this over your service shoe, thus providing that protection for your ankle to keep bugs, thorns, things like that, mud out of your boot. Now, the 1911 puttee, there were different designs between 1911 and 1920. They were worn during World War II, along with the wool spiral puttees I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier about. But this was the primary legging that mounted troops would wear. And this would be until about throughout the 1920s until the 1930 stovepipe tall brown cavalry boot was reinstituted in 1930. But up until that point, it was between this and the wool spiral puttees. Now, if you look at the 1911 puttee, and you look at a tanker boot, you kind of start to see some familiarities. Right? Leather straps, buckles, remember that. All right, so fast forward a little bit more. In the late 1930s, after the U.S. Army began the mechanization process and increased the tanks, armored warfare, it was starting to slowly, very slowly, but after General MacArthur was chief of staff, he made an order for the mechanization process to kind of begin. And that really wouldn't be until just before World War II when it really kicked off. But the U.S. Army did have tanks and they were experimenting with it. And so there was a cavalry officer, and you might have heard of him before. His name is George S. Patton Jr. He had been a cavalryman since he graduated from West Point. He competed in the Olympics in 1912 as a swordsman and a pentathlon. Then he went to France after that to improve his sword skills and also trained with the French cavalry. And then Patton, throughout his military career, is known for creating unique items. He took a lot of pride in what he did between being a cavalryman and also a tanker. The last saber that was carried by the U.S. Cavalry was designed by him after his experiences in France, the 1913 Patton saber. Now, it's not really a saber because it's got a straight blade. That's why it's commonly called the Patton sword. But this was designed and approved by the Army by Patton himself. Now, before that was the 1860 light cavalry saber, which had been around since the 1860 up until the 1913 saber. So Patton's desire for making a changes and improvement in the uniform and the items used by troopers really did not begin with the tanker boot. Yes, so the tanker boot was inspired by Patton, and that's what we're going to move into. In 1937, when the tanker boot was designed, Patton was stationed at the Cavalry School in Fort Riley, Kansas. Now, there was a boot maker beginning in the early teens called Tietzler and Danner Boot Company, located in Wichita, nearby. And this boot company was known for making custom, private purchased boots for troopers stationed at the post. Now, in 1929, 1930, after the head cobbler Mr. Tietzler passed away, Danner moved to Omaha, Nebraska. And opened up his shop there. So Patton was familiar with the company. He had boots from Tietzler and Daner before that, and had ordered also cavalry boots from them as well. And so he knew the company, he knew the quality, because they were phenomenal quality boots. So in 1937, he approached Daner with, he wanted a boot designed for tankmen. And he wanted something easy. One, these are the reasons why the tank boot originally came to exist. One, something easy to get on and off in the confines of an armored vehicle. And if you've never been in a tank, especially early World War II tanks, it's tight in there. And even as tanks progress, there's not a whole lot of room. So, and tankers spend a lot of time inside their vehicles, hours, days on end. And so when you got to take your boots off, you got to change out your socks. When you're crammed in that gunner's position or that driver's position, it is not easy, and you can't get off the tank. It is not easy to put these on, which these did not come. This style did not come around until a year later, 1938, after they got rid of the wool spiral puttees, but inside the tank. And also mud. I tell you what, tanks love mud. No matter where you go, it could be the driest place on earth, you always run into mud and you're stuck in mud. And tankers and troopers are often just buried in mud. So, and mud can cake in leggings and the wool puttees, the wool spiral puttees, and it's a pain in the butt. So Patton wanted a boot that was easy to get on and get off inside the tank. And also to have a design to provide more circulation inside getting into the foot and into the boot when sitting in a position inside the tank for an extended period of time. So that is your original, historically based reason why the tanker boot was designed, and why we have it to this day. Now, again, Patton was a cavalryman, and the puttees had been around for so long that they're so common amongst the mounted service troops because they're a lot easier to get on and get off than leggings. So they took the design of the 1911 style puttee, and they turned it into a 10-inch tall boot with two buckles, one in the lower part of the upper portion of your foot, and one that wrapped around your ankle and the upper portion about 1.5 times around to secure the boot. Now, as the armored forces grew, especially after the creation of the armored forces in July of 1940, and throughout World War II to the end of in May 1945, the Daner Company produced 5,000 pairs of these boots by tankers. Now, the U.S. Army did not officially adopt them. They were not an issued item. You had to purchase them, and they're not cheap. They're not cheap today, and they were not cheap back then. But these were a prized item by tankers, and you'll see some of the photos in the video here of tankers from that time period, the early 40s and throughout World War II, wearing these boots. Now, did all of them wear these boots? Absolutely not. A lot of soldiers still wore your standard issued service boot during World War II with the leggings, and later on in the war they would wear it without the leggings, because again, GIs hated these things just as much as anybody else who's worn them throughout history, and leggings have been around since the 17th century, really. And then later in the war, they would also be issued, again, the double buckle service combat boot. And so tankers, again, throughout history, not all tankers in the United States Army have always worn these boots. It is a personal choice. The design has continued to be modified through the years. When the U.S. Army changed from brown boots to black boots in the 1950s, tanker boots then became black. Later on, I believe during the 1980s, I have not been able to confirm this yet, although I've talked to a lot of tankers that I know from World War II onward, been trying to really hone this in, but haven't been able to. At some point, the design changed to be instead of a 1/2-inch leather strap to a 1-inch leather strap, and an additional wraparound to the top of the boot. Now, when the Army changed to the Army combat uniform around 2006, 2007, then the tanker boot became the Desert Tan. When the U.S. Army once again changed its duty uniform to the current version of the Army combat uniform in the OCP camouflage, now they are Coyote Brown. Now, if you've ever served in Korea, or you ever known a tanker served in Korea, there are different versions of the tanker boot, predominantly coming out of Korea with 5 straps and 5 buckles, or 2 big flaps with 4 buckles. Those are not your traditional tanker boot. They're just the Korean style tanker boot. These ones here in particular, these are German tanker boots that American Army, again, because we're primarily the ones that wear them, but they were made in Germany when I was stationed there as a young tanker. So a unique thing about tanker boots, given all the safety legends I kind of talked about earlier, if they were such an important boot safety wise, this boot would be a mandatory item worn by all tankers. By not all Army tankers, but all Marine Corps tankers when Marine Corps had tanks. But I've talked, in conversations with a lot of Marine Corps tankers, or when the conversation comes up on social media, a lot of them never heard of them, never seen them, because this is an U.S. Army tradition. And also tankers around the world would be wearing them as well if there were such a safety risk with laces and flame retardant stuff like that. So another unique thing that if they were such a huge and safety important item is traditionally, and this tradition is kind of made up. I don't personally agree with it. I don't like it, but it is what it is. It's a tanker tradition, and it evolved some point during the Cold War. A United States Army tanker cannot technically wear your tanker boots until you qualify in a tank gunnery, and you thus earn your right to wear your tanker boots. If this, again, was such an important safety item for inside the tank, you should be wearing them from the moment you step foot on a tank and you graduate 19 kilo, 1 station unit training or tank school throughout history. Kind of like when an infantryman graduates their infantryman school, they earn their blue cord, blue discs. I personally think tankers graduating tanker school should be able to wear these boots immediately. But again, it is tradition, and it's all depending on the unit. So I hope today this video's provided you a little bit more history, kind of debunking some of those myths, showcasing the true original history from when the boot was designed and made in 1937 originally, and to kind of give you a unique, cool surprise. In this box here I have, before I close out, if you were a young tanker in the late 1930s, 1940s, and you spent your hard-earned money buying a pair of Danner tank boots, this is what they would come in. This is an original pair of tank boots that were made in 1943, still in its packaging. And so you would get this box from Danner, and they would come in this original color. The original color of the tank boot was russet brown. And this pair was made in 1943, so just over 80, going on 81 years old. And they're just as brand new as the day that they were made. Now, the reason they're in such perfect condition is the gentleman who purchased these boots in 1943, he was a tanker, served during World War II. He ordered a size 10C, and when he got them, they were a size 9. And so his son, when his son gave me these boots, said he was so upset, instead of returning the boots to Danner to get new ones, he just shoved them up in the attic and they stayed there forever. And he passed away a few years ago, and his son passed those boots on to me. So we keep them on display here at our conference room here at World War II Armor, and to showcase that history. Now, as you saw, they were russet brown. Through oiling, through waterproofing or dubbing and polishing, they would eventually get this darker brown color. All right, so I hope today you've enjoyed this video, learning a little bit more about the true history and its origins, its inspiration of the United States Army tank boot, or now in modern parlance, the tanker boot. We hope that some of this information, kind of debunks some of those myths that we've all heard over the years, and inspired to help tell the true story that's true history, because it's our history. Tank boots were made by tankers for tankers. It is our history. It's important that we preserve it together and inspire future generations to continue to tell that story, the true legend. From all of us here at World War II Armor, thank you for watching. Thank you for your support. We invite you to like, comment, subscribe on our different social media platforms, and we truly hope to see you at one of the different events that we attend around the country, where we take out the World War II steel steeds, we run them, we gun them, we showcase what it was like to be a U.S. Army tanker in World War II, and to preserve their history and to continue their heritage and honoring their memory. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.